Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Stephen Ward, Director of Strategy and External Relations at the Council for Licensed Conveyancers. First time we've managed to get you onto the podcast, actually, Stephen. So brilliant to have you here. So much to get our teeth into. We try and keep the podcast to somewhere around 25 minutes to half an hour. I don't know whether we'll manage that today, but we'll give it our best shot. In the first instance, not that you need a huge amount of introduction, but perhaps you might tell us a little bit about yourself and your role, please, at the CLC.
So I've been at the CLC for getting on for 13 years. And my role there is strategy and external relations. It's planning the work of the CLC going forwards, making sure that we are ahead of the curve in terms of protecting consumers and supporting the development of thriving conveyancing and probate practices. We were established in the mid-80s to provide competition in the provision of then just conveyancing, and I think that's been effective. Conveyancing has, of course, changed enormously in the intervening period, not all because of the existence of the CLC, obviously, but I think that our outcomes-focused, risk-based approach, which is very much based on close working with the firms that we regulate, the practices that we regulate, delivers real benefits to consumers in avoiding risk crystallizing as harm in many cases, and that obviously is helpful to the practices themselves.
We're going to come on to the risk agenda in the course of the discussion. We actually originally planned this podcast a couple of weeks ago all around talking about client accounts. And in the intervening period, we've had some response to the consultation on client account from the Solicitors Regulation Authority. And literally in the last week, we've had, we're not quite sure whether it's Mazur or Mazur, and some of the queries around that decision and how it might impact conveyancing. So there's quite a bit to get our teeth into. Let's start with the regulator's view of the current risk landscape out there for conveyancers. And let's start on that client account issue, because you've been quite open, and as a regulator, I was a little surprised to hear you kind of say that if firms are planning on client account remaining as it is in their financial planning, then they shouldn't, because it's going to change. You still stand by that?
I think so, and that remark wasn't a reflection of the SRA's consultation or what it might or might not do. No, not at all. And I should say as well that the CLC doesn't have any plans to require a move away from client account as we know it at the moment. But I think there are a number of things that are happening. The vital digitization of the conveyancing process makes it easier to move to alternatives to client account, third-party managed accounts, whether they're provided by somebody like Shield Pay or PEXA, or perhaps another payment provider that will take advantage of the Bank of England's work on real-time gross settlement, which will come in the next few years. The other thing that's happening is that the government is looking at interest on client account and whether that might be a source of money to fund access to justice, legal aid, as we'd more commonly call it. That happens in a lot of other jurisdictions. So I'd be really surprised if we didn't go down that route here when, money for those sorts of public purposes is so tight. The big driver, of course, is the continued risk around client money in client account. Those fraudsters that we always talk about, they're not spotty youths in a basement in Belarus. They are businesses with HR departments, targets, highly motivated because they know that conveyancers hold very substantial sums of money in the client account, albeit for brief periods, but they are very motivated, as I say, and they are constantly creating new and more sophisticated ways to fool you. So I think that all of those things taken together will mean that in 5 years' time, and certainly in 10, the client account won't be with us in the way that it is now. And certainly any firm that relies on interest on client account to support its business should be thinking very carefully about that.
It forms part of the risk agenda that you published earlier this year in the summer. And I know you kind of want to go on and talk a little bit about that. What's the kind of climate out there like for conveyancing as far as risk is concerned, and as far as the agenda is sort of outlining at the moment?
Yeah. So as I said at the top, we have a very close working relationship with all the practices that we regulate. Each of them has a designated regulatory supervision manager. And through that monitoring process, we have a very clear understanding of what's going on in each practice, but also what's going on in terms of trends across the industry. And there are some very familiar risks in our 2025 risk agenda. There are some risks that are always with us, others that are evolving. But there are two risks that we've included this year that I would highlight as big areas of focus for the profession. And they are post-completion work. I don't like calling it that because you haven't completed the job until title registration is done and dusted and any sort of lending charges registered accurately. And the other one is consumer complaints handling. And I'm sure that in comments on your site, on your stories and so on, there's quite a lot about both of those areas of conveyancing. So looking at post-completion work first, and I think this was in part made worse by the stamp duty land tax holidays that I hesitate to say enjoyed during the COVID and post-COVID period, but they happened then, where, perhaps a backlog of post-completion work built up. And we've seen, very bad examples of that being neglected, properties coming to be retransacted, and the seller discovering, I don't even officially own it because it's not registered at land registry. Now, obviously, there's a backlog at land registry, and so that's a thing. But we know that is not the only cause, because land registry now also publishes what's called requisition data, the list of the avoidable, in this case, mistakes that conveyancers make when submitting title changes to land registry. And the numbers tell a great story, because in some practices it's practically zero mistakes, and in other practices it's up to sort of 15 or 20% of submissions having an avoidable error in them. And that can be fixed. That can absolutely be fixed. So we've run courses with land registry specifically for CLC practices that have been really well received. And we're urging practices to really use that data that they get from land registry, understand what might be driving their requisitions and trying to get those rates down, because apart from anything else, it costs you, the firm, a lot of money to put a requisition right. And, you've been paid at that point. So it's eating into your profit. It's absolutely eating into your profit. It's leaving your client unprotected and the lender as well, potentially. So it's a big risk. So that's an area where we want to see improvement. And on complaints handling, there's a bit of an odd one, really. And sometimes I feel a bit guilty for including it, because the sheer numbers of complaints about conveyancing, if you look at the numbers of transactions each year, are quite low. And I think that speaks to the high standards that we maintain across the industry. But there are some, and it's always better not to have them, and it's great learning opportunities, all those good things. But it's really important that firms do all they can to deal effectively with those complaints themselves, because once they get escalated to the legal ombudsman, they start to cost the entire industry a lot of money. The cost that the legal ombudsman charges back to the industry for one complaint that it has taken to investigation is greater than most conveyancers would charge for a sale and purchase transaction. And I think that should concentrate people's minds a bit. So there are really good reasons anyway for getting complaints handling at what we call first tier within the firm done well and done accurately. Of course, some clients will just always complain and want to take it to the next step. They'll feel aggrieved for whatever reason, and they will go to that's unavoidable. But what we see is that, the costs of Leo are escalating, and we need to get a lid on those, because that's also a cost to the consumer at the end of the day. We can bring that down. So those are two big ones that are kind of not, in a sense, the old familiars, the classic risks that we've highlighted in the past, but where we see real difficulties and where we think that where we know conveyancers can do a lot better, because performance across the sector varies wildly from firm to firm. So yeah.
I mean, certainly, you sort of allude to the fact that they're not the sort of more usual risks that the CLC have talked about. And of course, there's so much written and said about anti-money laundering that
yes.
we'd probably need a podcast that would last into next week to cover a lot of that stuff.
But it's really important.
I sense that the CLC as an organisation run a real tightrope between representing the best interests of its regulated community, the conveyancers, and also sort of putting pressure on people like HMLR to improve, because there is a real issue there. Yes, they're putting some of it right, but for conveyancers, day in, day out, dealing with HMLR is very difficult for them.
That's undeniable. But what is also true is that the Land Registry is doing a lot of work to deal with the backlog. And for the more standard applications that go in now, you will get a good turnaround time. If it's a first title registration or it's very complex, that might be a different matter. But for standard work, that's being done really well now. But you're right. We stand, as a regulator, we stand in the middle of everybody in a way. Sometimes feel like a bit of referee. And I just tiny correction on one thing. We're not looking the Society of Licensed Conveyancers and Conveyancing Association look after the interests of the firms. We very much want the firms to thrive and thrive, but our overwhelming aim is consumer protection. But unlike some other regulatory models, we don't stand back and wait for something to go wrong and then come in and clean it up. We work with the firm to make sure that things go well from the get-go, and so that's a slight difference there, and it does put us in a different position, I think, because we will point out to Land Registry, Revenue and Customs, lenders, where their behaviours, their processes could be improved or are causing difficulties, and that's in the client interest, but it's also in the industry interest, and it's in the national interest, because it's often been observed that the conveyancing process as it is run at the moment is not the ideal that we might all dream of, and we've got to get it better to serve the country better, to make it easier for people to move house to find work, to make it easier for people to downsize or upsize, all of those good reasons that would make the housing market function more effectively.
I want to come back to that because I know the CLC are very heavily involved in that. But let's come back and have a look at some of those proactive risks that you highlight and the role of the CLC, because the risk agenda, interestingly, touches on things like cryptocurrency, which is, that's a real hot potato, isn't it? And what I see there is that a lot of the decisions that are being made around some of that risk in particular are actually being driven by the insurance community saying, don't touch it with a barge pole.
Yes,
But do you see that it's the CLC's role to create a regulatory framework where cryptocurrency could actually be used as part of a transaction?
Technically, a firm could. There's no barrier to them getting involved in a transaction.
On a technical level, it can be done now, can't it?
The challenge is, how are you going to satisfy yourself about the source of those funds, and not entirely directly linked, but you will also need to satisfy yourself that those funds sit within your understanding of the source of wealth of the individuals involved in the transaction. So for many cryptocurrency platforms, that's very difficult to achieve, if not impossible, because by their very nature, you don't know where the money's come from. That's kind of the point of them, dare I say, in some ways. But there are other platforms that are regulated and where it's easier to trace the money coming in, going out, and the sources and so on. So, this comes back to the point about outcomes-focused regulation. We take this approach because we want to give practices the ultimate flexibility to deal with their clients in the way that suits the needs of their clients. And, Who knows how cryptocurrency will develop in future? We could all end up with crypto wallets containing some of our wealth, who knows? So we don't want to block that off as an avenue, but as the risk agenda sets out, your obligations in terms of money laundering and so on remain absolutely the same. You've got to be very sure of the source of funds and source of wealth that go into that transaction. And it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to do that with cryptocurrencies at the moment. So a few more firms have been asking us recently, and our response is to say, be very, very careful indeed. The sums that are involved in conveyancing, the degree to which conveyancing relies on the reputation of the conveyancer, and the willingness of lenders to engage with you as a conveyancer should give you serious pause for thought about whether you're going to engage in that sort of a thing or not. And then, of course, your insurer will advise you whether they will accept it or not as well. But very often insurers will consider things on a case-by-case basis. I'm not thinking so much about cryptocurrency. I'm thinking about other types of transactions that you might get involved in. They're always up for a conversation, in my experience.
Another element of the risk agenda that isn't so widely talked about, auction houses. I thought it was really interesting that you picked up on some of the risks associated there. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, well, the risk there relates to some reports we've had, some concerns we've had expressed by conveyancers we regulate who've been dealing with auction sales, who've had concerns about the robustness of that auction house's AML checks and the due diligence that they've done. And obviously, when something is going through an auction, you've got to be very confident up front about all of the elements of that transaction. So, what we're saying is, be careful, make sure that the due diligence has been done effectively and that you have time to do any due diligence you need as well, that you might feel you need to do, and to raise with us any concerns you have about, particular organizations. We're always interested in that kind of intelligence.
I want to move on to Mazur, which for the uninitiated was a decision made around the ability of unqualified people to do litigation work, and it was very specifically about litigation, wasn't it? But there has been this furore that's kind of fallen out of it around the wider issue of unqualified staff doing reserved legal activity, even if they're supervised. And of course, within conveyancing, that goes on a fair amount. We know that. And in fact, in order for some of the models of business that we know to be competitive, they need to. Does the CLC have a view on the decision and its impact on conveyancing?
Well, our view is fairly simple, and I should commend today's Conveyancer for the great article pulling together comments from across the industry that was fairly enlightening on all of this. Quoted myself, so I would say so, you might think. But we're very clear on this. The Mazur doesn't have any implications for the practice of conveyancing. The legislation, the Legal Services Act 2007, I was about to say it's very clear. The wording is not perhaps as crystal clear as you might dream of, but it is quite clear in its effect that conveyancing and probate are both reserved activities, obviously, in terms of legal services, but they are reserved activities which may be delivered by non-qualified fee earners, let's call them that, under the supervision of qualified lawyers. And, in the firms that the CLC regulates, there are Silex lawyers, CLC lawyers, obviously, solicitors, I think we've even got a couple of barristers supervising the work of others who may be on the route to qualification, not intending to qualify at all, have many years of experience of conveyancing or probate and be very expert at it, but not qualified. But all of those acting under supervision, and that's entirely within the framework that the Legal Services Act sets up. So I think everybody should rest assured that the business model for conveyancing isn't going to have to change overnight as a result of this ruling.
There are existential threats, or what appear to be existential threats, coming left, right, and centre at the sector at the moment. Take Mazur as an example. You take client accounts as another example. What does the future of conveyancing kind of look like? And as a regulator, how do you ensure that you move with the times enough so that you allow for that flexibility. And we'll take cryptocurrencies as an example because we've talked about it, but not so much that suddenly you're opening the floodgates to, a wholly unqualified scenario where, a firm can take a transaction all the way through from start to finish, with very little supervision, for the sake of argument.
Yeah. Well, I think that the future for conveyancing is really bright, actually, and a lot of well, no, not a lot. Some people say, oh, AI is going to come take all our jobs, the robots are going to do this for us. Well, they're not. All of the AI solutions and other tech solutions that I see around conveyancing, and the approaches that the Digital Property Market Steering Group are taking, the work that the Open Property Data Association is doing, for example, all of these initiatives have the ability to completely transform the way that conveyancing is done, so that there'll have to be much less effort put into the sheer gathering of information and data to underpin the transaction, and much more emphasis will be able to be put on understanding the client's needs from the transaction and advising them on that basis, and really giving them the best possible advice. And that's taking you back to where conveyancing started, really, is protecting the buyer and the lender in this transaction. So I think that's really positive sort of prospect that we have for the future of conveyancing. The great news is that, pretty much all of the data that we need to be digitalized has been. The industry knows what needs to happen, and now it just needs to be brought together to make it happen. It will mean a lot of us all moving together in lockstep. We keep ahead of that by being incredibly engaged with the Digital Property Market Steering Group and many of its members, the work that prop tech and law tech and fintech startups are doing that hold the prospect of this sort of transformation, and keeping a close eye on changing consumer expectations. And it's really interesting. A lot of the talk is about the speed of a transaction. A transaction takes too long now. It needs to be, a month. Now, undoubtedly true, most transactions take far longer than they should do at the moment. We can all agree that. But what the consumer really wants is not a very fast process, but a process in which they have confidence and where they reach a point of certainty quite quickly. So they know that they will move into their new home on X date, and they can plan around that. And so much when we look at complaints that we receive or read about from Leo, so many of the complaints are around a lack of certainty and the uneasiness that brings. And then, that starts, the client starts questioning everything because everything seems so uncertain. So I think that the future looks good. And I think that new ways of working will free up conveyancers to do what they're best at, which is, advising the client, doing the law for them. And I think that should be a really exciting opportunity for every practice that's out there. But I think, I also come across skeptics who say, I remember when One Dome said they'd fixed conveyancing for us all, or, we had HIPS, we had the chain matrix, and no, none of that happened. I'm happy with my, my PDFs. I send them to the other side, I get the inquiries back. It's all great. I think if, going back to consumer expectation a bit, if you don't move to meet new consumer expectations, I've talked about confidence and certainty, this is the Amazon world that we live in. Instant gratification and being able to track the parcel from wherever to wherever. And I know that's said a lot. It's become a bit of a truism, but it's because it is true. This is the world we all live in now, and this is what consumers expect. So, and I think the new ways of working can give them that, can give them rapid certainty, especially if we move to things like conditional contracts, sometimes called reservation agreements, which is more easy once you've got material information and upfront information. So, it's all going in the right direction. And now I think there's a lot of will from government, from the industry. It's just about those few last players coming together and really putting their backs into it as well.
I often ask people whether we need government intervention in order to create this utopia that you talk of, or whether it's regulators' responsibility. I mean, let's take, for the sake of argument, ID verification, where, with the wave of a magic wand, if the CLC said you can rely upon an anti-money laundering check all the way through a transaction, then I don't know whether that's a solution or not. I mean, presumably that's something you've thought of and dismissed, but that kind of thing, where is it your role to facilitate that? Where is it government's role? And I mean, going back to the sort of question around how much do you stargaze as much as sort of make sure that you're doing the here and now?
Yeah. So digital ID checks are great things. It's often been said that, that we know that ID checking is an obstacle in onboarding, and clients get annoyed because they have to do it for each professional individually, and that takes time. So we absolutely do want to get to a point where every professional who needs to know the ID of the person they're dealing with can rely on a check that was done at the beginning. That might be done by the mortgage broker, it might be done by the estate agent, it might be done by the conveyancer if somebody's instruction conveyancer early on in the process, which I think they should do. That's another point. Other professionals in the chain need to be able to rely on that. But for us to say you can rely on that check, we need the scheme in place so that we can be sure that the first check that was done to an adequate standard, using the right tools and so on. Because if you don't know that, you can't say rely on it then. So the government's got its legislation through now that builds a framework for those kinds of schemes, and we need an ID scheme for the property market that will enable that. And it's there. I can smell it, I can taste it. It's coming soon. And that's a great leap forward, but that also goes to, it's similar about all that shared data. So if you've got your searches data, obviously there's always information that comes from the seller themselves, and that is just what it is, but you need to know it's from the seller itself, so treat it in that way. But you've got local authority data, mines data, whatever it is, you can't just say, oh, there it is, I trust it all. You need to be able to be secure in that trust. So we need a trust framework around that, and that's coming too. So what we're doing is building the infrastructure so that this utopian vision is built on rock, and can be delivered. I mean, I remember before the COVID pandemic, about half of our firms are using digital ID tools. And I was having robust conversations with the other half, asking them why they weren't doing it. And they said, we're really happy with our paper checks. We like to see people in person, and I like to see their passport. And, well, how do you know it's a real passport? And, it doesn't matter. We get certified copies. Do you check that the law firm that certified those exists? All those sorts of things. Then, we all had to move to remote working overnight, and suddenly all of those fears, all of that clinging to the past just dropped away, and people understood, no, this is a safe system I can use. Why aren't I using it? And now we're at something like 98% adoption. I don't know. So that's really, really good. And it's a good example of how external pressures can drive progress. I think what we lack, and this is actually a whole other discussion, is what we lack in conveyancing is, because most people use conveyancing so infrequently, there isn't the consumer pressure for change there. Somebody gets through a transaction, they collapse on the packing boxes in their new home and say, well, thank God that's done for another 20 years. So there isn't that consumer pressure for change, which other industries will feel more acutely.
There is no doubt that consumer pressure is, definitely another conversation, but a big element of this that is missing. You're absolutely right, and if you sort of think about some of the transformation that happened in other areas, a lot of it was driven by consumer adoption. And what I'm particularly pleased about in the course of the discussion, Stephen, is to hear your kind of passion for the change that is happening, because one of the biggest frustrations I have writing today's Conveyancer is that we have a readership that perhaps covers 20-25%, possibly 30% of conveyancers out there. But I'm under no illusion that there are lots of people that don't read today's Conveyancer as much as I might wish they do, and they don't necessarily go to conferences and hear this stuff, and don't fully appreciate the direction of travel and the progress that has been and is being made as well. And you talked about building foundations on stone.
Yeah,
that's so critical. This is moving home is such an important part of the UK economy.
Yeah.
That we simply can't afford to get this wrong. And there was I think it was in one of the HM Land Registry podcasts, Mike Harlow said, this is an £8 trillion sector. We cannot afford to mess it up. So, I'm wholeheartedly agree with you that we're absolutely moving in the right direction. Before we finish, we bring you a short addition to this podcast, which was originally recorded in the days before the government consultation on improving and reform to the home buying and selling process. And we thought it would be very remiss of us to not touch on that in the course of the discussion, because of course the CLC has got a view and it's got a vested interest in it as well, Stephen. So firstly, what's the CLC's reaction to the consultation?
Well, we really welcome this consultation. It's really looking at some important issues, and it demonstrates the political will there is to deliver change to the home buying and selling process, which, as we've talked about, needs fixing. Transaction times are too long, fall through rates are too high, and all that sort of stuff. And it really supports the fundamental role that data plays in all of this, and getting the data right, getting it shareable and trusted and so on. So we think it's really, really helpful. In a way, it's slightly disappointing because that it has to happen at all. I mean, because when I was at the DPMSG conference 2 years ago, nearly, I was asked, would changes have to be mandated? So were the professionals involved in conveyancing going to have to be forced to change? I said, absolutely not. This is all in the gift of the industry, or the vast majority of it is the gift of the industry. We change the ways we work, and we know what needs to change. However, there has been some resistance to change, or some slowness of adoption. So I think what's being discussed here in these consultations is really important, especially around material information and upfront information, the broader set of information that's probably set up in the BASB that the Home Buying and Selling Council have developed, which really kickstarts the home selling process and, of course, the home buying process, because buyers deserve better information than they get at the moment when they're viewing properties.
There's a huge amount to unpick in the consultation, and sadly we've already done the vast majority of this podcast, so I don't want to spend the next hour talking about the consultation. That's for another time. But one of the points that I picked out was the fact that conveyancers are going to be compared or accredited in some way. Is there any indication as to how that might happen?
No, and I think actually I'm not sure whether that was applying to conveyancers as well as estate agents, or just estate agents. That wasn't clear to me just yet. The one thing I would say is that we always encourage clients, home buyers, home sellers, to shop around for a conveyancer and to use a digital comparison site, Trustpilot, Really Moving, or one of the others in this area, because we think it's really important. As we talked about in the main bit of the podcast, there's very little consumer pressure to improve the conveyancing service, but increased shopping around, increased use of other consumers' reviews helps to, I think, start to make good that gap. So we're keen to engage on how that might be done more. Of course, our transparency rules already require conveyancers and private practitioners to make available a lot of information for potential clients so that they can see what they'll be getting and how much it will cost and how it will be delivered before they commit. And I think if we can evolve that, I think that will all be good.
And a final question, I mean, dare I say, I assume the answer is yes, but you know what they say about assuming. The CLC will be responding to both the home buying and selling consultation and the separate consultation on material information?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really strongly recommend not only every conveyancing practice, but every conveyancer to have a look at the consultation, because it will really help you understand the direction of travel for the future of conveyancing. And it's really important that everyone has their say as we move forward. It's really, really important. So yes, look out for our consultation. We always publish our consultation responses on our website, but also, have a think about yourself as a practice or an individual conveyancer, what you think about these proposals.
And it's quite time sensitive, isn't it? Because the consultation closes on the 21st of December.
That's
so
right.
Definitely worth having a look at. We have done a whistle-stop tour around regulation, and I'm very appreciative of your time and for coming onto the podcast. Thank you very much indeed for joining.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Stephen. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.